This is Professor Lynn Porter from Fairfield University, and this is my lecture on ancient Egyptian architecture and decor. A lot of the architecture of ancient Egypt was affected by its geography. So I want to point out that we're talking about the northeastern corner of the continent of Africa. And there in the left-hand corner, I've given you just a map of Egypt proper. And of course, the most important area in Egypt is along the Nile River. Zooming into the Nile River, on the left we have a satellite view of the Nile River Valley, and then on the right you have a map of it. And you see on the map all of these different major cities and major monuments from ancient Egypt, and it's all along that river. Of course, this makes sense because people need water in order to live, and so much of the culture we're talking about is centered there on that most important river. All right, I want to lay out what it is I'm going to be talking about here. First of all, I'm going to talk about the overall character of all of the built structures of this culture. And then we're going to look more closely at two different types of public buildings, tombs and temples. We'll look at the construction methods used to build those tombs and temples, as well as the decoration and ornament of these various built objects. And of course, we're talking about decor also, and that often comes down to furniture. So we'll take a look at ancient Egyptian furniture and the decorative motifs that we will see both in the architecture as well as in the furniture. So those are all the things that I'm going to be talking about in this lecture. Okay, starting with the overall character of all of the structures we're going to be looking at. We can say in a word, they are colossal. This is a massive, massive structure that they are solid. They're using rectangular forms and very clean geometry and these beautiful straight lines. And you can say that about both the temples and the tombs. Of course, a pyramid is a tomb. So starting in more detail on the public buildings, we're going to be looking at three different types of tombs. First, we're going to be looking at mastabas. We'll see some pictures in a second here. And then the royal pyramids, both the stepped pyramids and then what we think of as the smooth-sided pyramids later in the culture. And then also rock-hewn tombs. And in terms of the temples, we'll be looking at the cult temples and the mortuary temples. And what you're seeing here is these are the major structures that we have that tell us what was going on in ancient Egypt. Okay, let's take a closer look at those tombs. Here we have a mastaba. Looks like just a block, right? Just a lump in the desert, doesn't it? Right? Okay, obviously it's rectangular. It is a funerary mound that has then been covered with brick or stone, generally with these slightly sloping sides and a flat top. But what's really going on in the mastaba is underground. Here we have two views of that same mastaba. The top drawing here is a ground plan view. So you have this massive block that is the big chunk of stone above ground. But if you look at this bottom drawing here, this is a section view. And so what we're seeing here is this block on top of the ground, but then these tunnels under the ground. And there at the very, very, very bottom in that little tiny rectangle, we have the actual tomb itself. That is the chamber where this person is buried. So we have buried this person in the earth, and then we have built this massive structure on top of the earth to pretty much make sure nobody gets down to the actual tomb itself. And if we know anything about ancient Egypt, we know that these tombs were robbed. They were plundered, frequently not long after they were actually built. So That got to be a problem. So let's see if we can solve that problem of plundering another way. So here we have a step pyramid. These appeared in the archaeological record after the mastabas, and this is one of the most famous, the step pyramid of Djoser. Okay, so you see why it's called a step pyramid? Because it's a pyramid with steps. Again, the burial chamber is still underground. And basically, it's a series of mastabas, one on top of the other. They're just getting smaller and smaller and smaller, forming these steps. But when we look at a cross-section view of that same pyramid, you see the underground chamber there. The very, very bottom is where we have the burial chamber and various little drawings of where robbers got in, first ones, second ones, third ones, various people burrowing down through it. And so it started as a mastaba, that's the dark brown area, and then a step pyramid was built over top of that. And then an even bigger step pyramid was built over top of that. So these successive attempts at trying to prevent grave robbers from getting into these tombs. And that the problem of grave robbers was one of the things that led to these larger and larger and larger structures. And later in the ancient Egyptian culture, the step pyramids were replaced with smooth-sided pyramids. Now, the great pyramids that we're used to seeing here, these are the great pyramids of Giza, were made of granite and originally covered with limestone blocks that have since been removed and repurposed for other construction. I love this photograph. It makes me feel like I'm in the Indiana Jones movie. So here's another view of the same pyramid complex. Look in the forefront, there's even several smaller step pyramids. And if you're looking for a sense of scale, on the very left-hand side, you see humans on horseback. Wow, these are massive. You know that word colossal I used before? Yeah, this stuff's colossal. And here we have a cross-section view of the Great Pyramid from that same pyramid complex. Down, of course, there's this huge triangular structure that we see above ground, and this is about the ground level right here. Down here we have a subterranean chamber. Here, letter K is the king's chamber, and F is the queen's chamber. So not only do we have a chamber underground, but now we're actually building them into this massive pyramid above ground. But again, you see this huge amount of stone that is being used to in, encase several very, very small rooms. And here's that same pyramid, but now we're standing very, very close to it and looking up the pyramid. And I like this picture because it gives you a sense of the scale of these stones. Down here, look at this guy. That is taller than his shoulders. So these are very, very high steps. It's easy to look at them and think, oh, I could just walk up them like I'm walking upstairs. But these are very, very high. And actually, we have people over here on the right-hand side who are going into the pyramid. They're going into what's called the robber's entrance, where one of the first sets of robbers actually broke into the pyramid. And this is a shot inside the entrance passage of that same pyramid. And I just included this to show you that this is a solid structure. Every single little square inch of it is solid stone, but for those really narrow pathways that are built within it. So it's a massive, colossal structure built above ground to be used as a tomb. This is another form of a tomb. This one isn't built out of blocks that are stacked up together like the step pyramid and the smooth-sided pyramids we've just been looking at. This is hewn from rock. That means it was carved out of a mountainside. This is a radically different technique here. We are literally carving away mountain to make a tomb here. This is actually both a tomb and a temple for a Queen Hatshepsut who declared herself to be a pharaoh. Think about that. You have to find a chunk of this mountainside or this massive cliff, and then you have to hire people to come in and chip it away and then carry the stone away in wheelbarrows or something so that you can eventually reveal this structure. It's a very different construction method than what we've been talking about before. This is a sculptor's point of view in terms of how we can build a tomb or a temple. How marvelous, right? Okay, we've been looking at various tombs. Let's also look at some temples. The overall design of ancient Egyptian temples was amazingly stable, and that's one of the things I want to point out here. Over a culture that lasted more than 4,000 years, they pretty much had these basic design concepts. The temples all have an axial alignment. That just means that they follow a straight line. So as you move through the building, there is this sense of progression. You go from the front of the building to the middle of the building to deeper and deeper and deeper into the building. You'll see what I mean in a second when I show you some pictures. The first part of the building is called a pylon or the gateway. Again, it's monumental. It is huge and it is a monument to someone. So this pylon is a massive wall. It's slightly slanted, so it's wider at the base than it is at the top. And it doesn't have anything, no windows or any openings built into it, just a central opening, a doorway. And once you get past the pylon, you move into the courtyard area. And after the courtyard, you move into the hypostyle hall, which is a covered area where you have this tight cluster of columns. And the columns in the middle of the hypostyle hall are taller than the columns around the side. So that forms this kind of high, it's called a clear story, but basically a clear story is a really, really high window area that's going to let a lot of light down into this area. And once you've moved through the hypostyle hall, you come to the sanctuary where there is a statue of the king or the statue of the king as a god. That is the basic heart of the temple. And then the sanctuary is small, so surrounding it, there are various treasure rooms around the sanctuary. Okay, so let's figure out what we're looking about here. This is the Temple of Khons at Karnak, which is a small, typical temple that I want to just explain to you. First of all, you're going to come in here, over here on the left-hand side. We're coming in here. So we have this massive wall. This is our pylon right here. That's a massive structure that we're going to come through the center of into this courtyard with this series of columns around the outside, but it's this large open area that then we process through there into the hypostyle hall, which is, you see how it's getting smaller and smaller and more secluded, and then eventually moving into the sanctuary there where we would have that some kind of sculpture or some kind of memorial for the god, the king god, and then all of these little rooms around the outside that are for the treasury. In the top part of this drawing, we have the same thing. You have this massive, massive pylon. There's a person right there. There's the height of a person. And then we move into the courtyard, and then the hypostyle hall, and then we have our central sculpture and all of the other treasury rooms around the building. Here's another view of the same temple, and I want to point out that a large area of this had a roof on it. Now, the roof doesn't exist today because of the wearing of time, but everything but the courtyard, the center area of the courtyard, that area right in here, had a large roof on it. Okay, but you start to get a sense of this pylon here being this massive wall. And some of these temples have a series of sculptures leading up to the pylon. That's part of this processional feeling you get through the entire structure. And now here we are at that same temple, but now these are actual photographs of what it looks like today. You see the series of sculptures in the front, so that's an avenue of sphinxes that lead up to this massive pylon wall. And you see how the pylon is thicker at the base and narrower at the top, and it has that curved top to it. That's called a cavetto. And here we are now in that same temple. Now we're in the courtyard. And remember that big series of columns around the side. A series of columns, by the way, is called a colonnade. And this is our doorway into the hypostyle hall that we're seeing here. Again, you get a sense of the massiveness of this construction. That temple we've been looking at is actually part of a very large temple complex because these were built over and over and over for each one of them celebrating a different god or king. And so I just want to point out in this massive temple complex at Karnak, what we've been looking at is right down here. There's our little sphinxes, and there's our courtyard, hypostyle hall, and moving into the center of the sanctuary. So it's what we've been looking at is actually a very small temple, but it very cleanly describes the basic construction that you see in all of the temples. So I want to look at a couple other temples. This one is for Amenhotep III. This one's in Luxor. It's not part of that same temple complex. And here we are looking down directly toward the pylon with this massive doorway in the center. And there is an obelisk standing there. Looks very much like what we have in the middle of Washington, D.C. That is an ancient obelisk. There would have been another one on the right-hand side. And then we have these two colossal seated sculptural figures that are on either side of the doorway through the pylon also. Various pieces of these have been taken apart and traveled around the world, or just been taken apart and used for the building materials. So we don't have the entire thing all together. Of course, originally this would have been absolutely symmetrical. Two obelisks, two matching seated figures, and then a series of standing figures. You see one at the right-hand side, guarding the obelisk. Here we are moving down through the center of the pylon. Again, I love this picture because it shows how big things really are. Those people are human-sized people, which gives you a sense of how massive these sculptures are. Same temple moving into the courtyard. There's the colonnade around all three sides. The pylon would be right behind us. And we have this large open area in this colonnade. And look at these columns. Aren't those interesting shapes? We're going to take a closer look at that in a minute. Is the same temple. This is the hypostyle hall, where you have that tight cluster of columns, and all of them are holding up beams. You notice the beam on top. So the columns hold up these beams, which then hold up the ceiling. And I include this photograph, which was taken around 1858, which shows the columns, the same columns we've been looking at, half buried in the sands of the desert. So as we all know that sand moves tremendously over time. So it's kind of mind-boggling to think that over time, these temples and these tombs were half buried simply with sand, and they've been gradually excavated, basically within the last 150, 175 years. Okay, let's move along to talking about the construction methods. What we've been seeing is column and lintel construction. It's also called trabeated construction, where you have a column and a lintel. A lintel is that beam sitting on the top of two columns. It's a very common construction form. And the top of the column is a decorative capital, and the capitals mimic the kinds of plants from the area. So we see some that are a lotus bud, or a papyrus bud, or a palm shape, or a campaniform, which is a bell shape, mimicked from Mother Nature's plant world. Where we have a wall, it's crowned with a cavetto molding. We saw that at the top of the pylon, where it had that large curved molding at the top. And in terms of decoration, the carvings are incised. They're cut into the stone, but not very deep. They're a relief. They are not fully three-dimensional rounded carvings. So let's make sure we understand what these terms are. Here we are looking at the Temple of Horus in Edfu. We have trabeated construction. We have this series of columns with these beams on top, or the post and lintel, or column and lintel construction. And then we have this wonderful large molding on top of the wall. And that molding is that curved shape. That's the cavetto shape. And look at the tops of the columns. They're different, aren't they? Some of them are a papyrus shape. Some of them are a palm shape. So carving to mimic the vegetation of the area. Here we're actually looking up those columns, and you can see how close they are together. Now, the lintels themselves are rather weak. Stone will break if it's too long, so you have to have columns pretty close together so the lintel doesn't break. And that's one of the reasons why the columns are so close together. But this is also a great shot because you can see the incised relief that's carved into these columns. Like the entire surface of these columns has decoration carved into it. We'll take a look at more closely at some of this decoration. And you can see how there's several different capital forms here. The capital is that very top of a column that's a decorative top. Looking closer at those columns at the Temple of Amenhotep III, these are lotus bud capitals, so it looks like a bundle of reeds with a lotus bud at the top, and then a square block, and then the lintel. Here's another interesting look at both the palm and the papyrus capitals. You see, it's kind of an abstract form of what Mother Nature grows, but definitely it's vegetation, isn't it? I also said that capitals come in campaniform. That's a bell shape. And here you are. Here's a definite bell shape from the Temple of Ramses II. How lovely. Okay, let's look a little closer at the decoration. The decoration is carved, it's incised, and the decoration covers the entire surface of a wall or the entire surface of a column. That's what we've been seeing. There's a word for that in the visual art world. It's called horror vacui, which literally translates to a fear of empty spaces. But every space is filled. When we do see human figures in the decoration, they are shown with what's called frontality, which is that abstract shape of the human figure. We'll look at some of those in a second here. We also have decorative hieroglyphs, which is a form of writing, and numerous decorative motifs. So talking about the incised relief, here's a really great view of some columns with that decorative relief carved into it. It doesn't go very deep, right? That's what it means to be relief. And here on the right-hand side is a close-up of one of those columns. So you get a sense that there's a little bit of sculpting going on, but a lot of it is this basic outline. And of course, in bright sunlight, that puts those beautiful shadows in there to make the lines show up. Here's another view of an interior. This is actually a chapel wall that's been restored. And you see how there is that incised relief, but you also see the painting that has been applied. So the entire surface is covered with all of these wonderful symbols and hieroglyphics. And here's a really great example of a human portrayed using the concept of frontality. You see how the head is always in profile, so you can see the full shape of the face, but the eye is always like it's to the front. The shoulders are square to you, but then the arms go to the sides. It looks like people used to walk really in this weird sideways way. That's not true at all. People have always been shaped like people. But the concept of frontality forces the idea that we want all of the important pieces to be included so that they go on to the afterlife. Here's another view of that same room. And another interior room with all of the painting restored. You see the colors tend to all be the same, that white, that rust brown, there's a blue-green in there, very consistent color palette. And we see the humans rendered in that frontality form, or sometimes they have these animal heads where they're in the shape of a god. So let's take a look at the furniture. If there's going to be one word to talk about the furniture, it's going to be rectangular. Though it's very clear in the design that human comfort was a factor. The wood is used in an economical form, which makes sense because when you live in a desert, you don't have a lot of wood. So what you do use, you're going to really be frugal with. We see lion leg and dog leg forms on both chairs and beds, and some inlay with both ivory and ebony, some gold ornament, and a lot of those symbolic motifs carrying through into the furniture. Because we are talking about rectangular furniture, the areas where people sat did have a cushion, but it was not upholstered or attached. It was a loose cushion, like a pillow sitting on top of a bench. So let's take a look at some of these pictures. On the left, we have a chair here made out of boxwood and ebony. And the seat was actually woven cord. So it's a little bit comfortable. But look at those feet. Those are lion-legged feet. Maybe a dog, maybe a lion. All right? Very cool. On the right, we have a stool from King Tutankhamun's tomb. So it's both painted and gilded. Gilded means coated with gold. And again, we see that the foot of the stool mimics the shape of an animal foot. Here we have two more chairs. The one on the left is painted wood, again with those animal feet. And on the right, we have a chair from Tutankhamun's tomb. So you see at the top, it's got a gold inlay of that winged disc. It's got gold around the feet of it. In fact, it looks like ivory, inlaid ivory toenails on the feet here. So these multiple decorative inlays. Here we have two thrones. The one on the left is actually the throne of a priest with wood and gold inlay. And on the right, a very famous chair. This is one from King Tut's tomb. So it's entirely gilded on top of the wood. So it's coated with gold and then painted on top of that. And even in this chair, you see an image of a pharaoh sitting in a chair. So even the chair itself tells us more about chairs. Of course, not everything is a throne or a fancy, fancy chair. Sometimes you just need a stool. The folding leather stool at the top looks a lot like any number of camp stools that I've seen when I've literally gone camping, or a very, very simple wood and woven reed stool. That would be more of a footstool. In terms of beds, these are two beds that came from King Tut's tomb. I think the lioness bed on the left is really fascinating because you see the front of the lioness with the whole head and ears and down into the feet, and then her long back, even her tail forming part of a headboard or footboard, and then the back leg. So it's an abstract form of the entire animal. How beautiful. And a lot of furniture has to do with storage. So tables and benches that have areas in them to store stuff. So we have on the left a casket for toiletries, a fancy box to put your toiletries in with ivory and enamel inlay. And on the right, we see a lovely chest on legs. So having looked at all of this furniture, do you see why I'm saying it's rectangular? Pretty much. And I even include this picture of a wall painting because these people are carrying furniture. So on the left, you see several people carrying one of those wonderful beds, and then several people carrying several of those chests. One person carrying that chair or the throne, and then people in the front carrying various kinds of vases. So we also get information about the furniture from the wall paintings. It's not just from the actual furniture that we have found. Okay, let's dig a little bit more into the decorative motifs that we're seeing in all of these images. Clearly, we have human figures. The winged sun disk is a symbol for protection. You frequently see it on the lintel over a doorway. The scarab beetle is a symbol of eternal life. The lotus bud and the lotus flower are symbols for purity. And the serpent is a symbol for royalty. We also have the ankh, which is a symbol for life. I'll point it out when we get to it. In our decorative motifs, we also see the cartouche, which is a particular shape surrounding other hieroglyphics, and the shape says this is a name of a person. So a cartouche is an indication of a name. And then we have other motifs that start with Egyptian culture, but they will carry through, and we're going to see them again this semester. There's the guilloche, which is a particular kind of a wave pattern. There's several other wave patterns, and there's a palmette shape. So let's see if we can identify some of these figures in actual photographs. In this image, we could see several of the motifs I just was talking about. We're looking up into the top of a doorway, so this is the lintel at the top of a door, and then you have that very large winged disc, right? It's just that center circle with the big wing on it. That is a symbol of protection for this building. We also, in the center here, have what's called the ankh shape. That's that shape right there. It's a little cross with a loop at the top. That is a symbol for long life. And we also, in the same lintel, we have two cartouches right here and right here. And that shape of that oval with the little foot on the end says everything inside of this will tell you who I'm talking about. It's a way to say this is somebody's name. In these two different bowls or fragments of bowls, we see that lotus motif, both painted on in the blue section or actually carved into as part of the shape of the clay itself in the green. And when you think about it, it makes sense. A lotus grows in an open pool of water. So this culture that is so dependent on that Nile River flooding it's going to celebrate that flood, that overabundance of water in the actual motifs that it's going to cherish. Here is another wall painting where we see some of those motifs. On the left, we see King Tut as the god Osiris, and on the right, we have another king coming up to him. Between the two of them, look above their heads, we see several different cartouches that identify who these people are, and both of them rendered with this idea of frontality. There on King Tut's chest, you see a scarab, that beetle. There you go. Very common motif in the culture. And the cartouches between their heads, identifying who they are, as well as the hieroglyphs explaining what's going on in this story. Looking again at that chair from Tutankhamun's tomb, at the top here we see the winged sun disk again. That's along the top of this chair. And in the figure here, the human figure, you see hanging off the arm is an ankh, right? That ankh symbol. This is a close-up of the handle of a dagger that I wanted to show you. At the top, you see this geometric zigzag motif. And then we have that colorful palmette motif. And then underneath that, we have that kind of a woven wave. That's called a guilloche. And that's a pattern we're going to see frequently. So the geometry, the palmette, and the guilloche are kind of cross-cultural images we're going to find. And of course, there's lots of other images and motifs that have been in some of these photographs, but I just wanted to point out the falcons and that abstract falcon shape. These are the falcons guarding the pylon at the Temple of Horus. Each one of them actually had a crown on top of their heads. And you can see that in the image here at the right. So there we have it. We've talked about the overall character of these structures. We've talked about tombs and temples. We've talked about the basic construction methods, the decoration, and then the furniture and the various motifs of this ancient Egyptian culture. Thank you for your time.